All right, I can already tell I'm going to have to do some editing here, but we're going to we're going to figure out how to share the screen like, let's see, like this. I think I need to share a screen and, uh-oh, I don't have the second monitor. That could be tricky today. Um, we'll have to do an application window. Let's see if we can get that to work. We'll do that. Yep, I was worried about that. Let's see if we can make it work a little smarter here. And we will try to do this right. What I'm going to do is trust that whoops, look at that too. Got to go all the way back to the beginning, huh? This is what happens when we deal with COVID-19, right? So today I am actually working from my home office, and hopefully everybody can see me. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to confirm that this is up and live in Facebook on my mobile device. So that is sort of the tricky part, right? Looks like it is, and hopefully you guys can see me okay. So we'll start from there, and if I've got anybody on my team that's watching this and you need to text me, my phone is here, we'll figure it out. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There ain't no free lunch, right? We're going to talk about economics today. We need to figure out pricing, and that's going to be something really important if we ever talk about investing. So let's look today at pricing, but first we got to go back and look at our previous bonus question. So yesterday we said, what is the yield on the 10-year treasury as of yesterday? Remember, we had talked about bonds, and yield is a clever way of describing rate of return, right? So if a bond is a loan and the interest is the yield. So what was the yield yesterday on a 10-year government treasury? 75 basis points is what that's called, or 0.75%. It's kind of crazy. Think about it. If you had $100 per year, they give you 75 cents. That's super, super low yield right now. So we're not super excited about yields in the treasury markets. But if you're borrowing money, you are, right? If you wanted to go try to borrow money, the interest is really low. So I know locally, for example, there's a school bond that the Roseburg School District is trying to put out there and hoping to do some infrastructure improvements. The good thing for them is if the bond is approved, it's a very, very low interest rate. So it's very low cost for them to do improvements with an infrastructure bond. Anyway, so yes, it's super low interest. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about economics. Normally, this makes people's eyes roll back in their head. You think, can we get more boring than economics? Maybe we can, but it's going to matter to you in real life. So what we're going to figure out today is, hey, you know what? We have to buy stuff in our life. How do we figure out how much it costs? And then we'll talk about how does this affect the economy and your investments, and what does it actually mean for you? Okay, so here is the number one rule in economics. There is no free lunch. Okay, nothing is free. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, no, I can go online and I can get certain things and those are free. Or maybe I've gone to Costco and they were handing out those samples. Those are free, right? So no, they're free to you. Maybe you didn't pay for it, but somebody paid for it. Somewhere, somebody always pays for it, right? If it's a fruit, you say, well, hey, I had to pick the fruit in the off the tree in the forest that nobody planted. Okay, but still you had to pick the fruit, right? So you didn't do something else. You made a trade to pick the fruit. So you traded your time for one thing instead of another. And one of the first things we established about money is it's how we trade our time. So nothing is ever free. If we know that as the backdrop, then we understand a little something about economics, and is that we have to figure out price. Right? So how much should something cost if it's not free? If it's not free to me, then somebody gave it to me, then they paid for it. And so here's the question, okay? How do we figure out what something costs? We figure it out depending on if we're the buyer or the seller, right? If we're buying something, we want to pay as little as possible for it. But if we're selling something, we want to pay as much as possible for it. And there may be some people out there that say, oh, I'm not trying to make a lot of profit. I just want to be this much. Okay, well, you're still determining what the price is. But in theory, pricing efficiency is between a buyer and a seller agreeing upon a price. Okay. Now, again, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, if I go into a store, there's just a price tag on it. Okay. Well, that's the seller testing you. There's no negotiation. There's no bartering. It's not like, well, I'll give you this much. No, I'll only take that much. There's no haggling. They're just establishing a price and you either are willing to pay it or not. But how did they come up with that too? Well, let's get into it. There are only two factors when it comes to pricing something. And I know it sounds crazy that there's only two, but there's really only two. The thing is, there's lots of things that go into the two, okay? The first is supply, okay? So what is supply? Supply is how much of the stuff is out there, okay? How much of it is available? If it was something that's everywhere, like air. Okay, well, you can just breathe air pretty much everywhere. Then there's so much of it that's so available that you're really not willing to pay for it, are you? Right? So it's basically free because nobody controls the supply. However, if you wanted to go scuba diving, right, and you wanted to be underwater and you needed to take air with you so you could breathe, then you might actually be willing to pay for the air. So you need a canister to put it in and something to control. And so all of a sudden you're thinking, oh my gosh, we just paid for air. Yeah, but it's scarce underwater. It's not available. So it requires something else. So the supply is infinite when we are on above water, and it's super rare underwater. So there's a weird example of supply being radically different. Now, if you're building stuff, if you have a factory, supply is how much can you make out of the factory, right? If you can make only one car a year, then your supply is super, super low. If you can make 1 million cars a year, then your supply is really high. And then the market gets to help you set the price. So what's the other factor? Demand. So if you want to sell something, that's great. Somebody else has to want to buy it. And that's what demand is. Now, demand is not you insisting on getting your way. It's just, hey, this is how much is out there, right? How much do people really want of this stuff? Okay. If it's no big deal, then you don't worry about paying for it. But if it's really important to you, then maybe you do. So if you think about it, it's your willingness to pay for something is your demand on the supplier. The supplier's ability to keep up with you is another contributing factor. So I have an example we'll talk about at the end that's very relevant today. But let's look at how the price actually gets determined, right? So you see on the one side, we have demand, and it's an arrow that's going down. I don't know if I get a mouse on screen here. There we go. So this arrow going down. Supply going up, right? So what it says is down here, the supply is very low, but the demand is very potentially high. Down here, the demand is very low, but the supply is very high. So this is air above land, and this is air underwater. Really low supply, really high demand. You really want to be able to breathe, right? So we know that somewhere in between is the price, right? And air is a dumb example, let's be honest, right? It's a dumb example. But if we were talking about anything, let's say it was, let's say we really like spaghetti, okay? So the supply of spaghetti there's a lot of spaghetti out there. You want to have a nice Italian meal. So let's have, you said, well, there's a lot of spaghetti available. Okay, but you have to cook it. And to get it just right, and you want the meatballs and the Parmesan cheese and all that on there. Well, somewhere is a spot where your willingness to pay and the available supply meets. And this area right here is what we're concerned about. That's actually the price. So we call this equilibrium. It's where the balance between supply and demand meet. And this is really important because ultimately that's how we determine. I mean, if you have something that you want to sell me and I don't care, you're like, hey, I want you to give me $10 for this widget. And they go, well, I don't want the widget. And they go, well, just give me $5. I go, look, I don't want the widget. And they go, well, how about $1? And I go, well, look, all right, for $1, maybe I'll buy the widget and I'll sell it to somebody else for $2. Okay, that was my demand was super low, but the supply was there was nobody else that wanted it. Now, what if that same person had 20 people that wanted to buy their widget and everybody got in a price war, right? So everybody tried to spend more money to get it. It could be $20 widget because that's how much somebody's willing to pay for it. And that's really what the supply is how many buyers matched with how many people that are sellers, and we find equilibrium. So what happens is the way that you change price is by changing demand. Let's say that we discovered that spaghetti was really bad for you, that if you eat too much spaghetti, it's gonna make you sick. Then the demand is going to shift. And you can see here how the demand said, well, it used to be that everybody wanted it. Now nobody wants it. It shifted this way. I don't know why we wouldn't want spaghetti, but work with me here, right? And what happens is where it used to cross up here, but now equilibrium has moved down because the demand curve has shifted, right? Everything moved as we changed how much people really wanted to get the thing. So if it was spaghetti, all of a sudden, I don't want spaghetti, I want something else. That's an important concept to understand because this is something that will come up if you ever listen on the news and they're talking about government policy. And they're saying things like, well, we need to work on supply side economics, or do we work on the demand side of economics? So the demand side means we're trying to change how much people want something. The supply side means we're trying to change how much is available. Most of the time, government works on the supply side. If you make it harder to supply something, then there's less of it. And if there's less of it, then the people that want it have to pay more because there's the same amount of demand, but there's less available. Rate raises the price, right? So think about diamonds are really rare. So if people want to buy diamonds, they have to pay a lot of money for it because they're really rare. Gravel is not very rare, right? You can get gravel in lots of places. And so the price is way cheaper than diamonds because of the supply and the readily available nature of those two things. Okay. So I just sort of talked about ahead of time here. That's what happens with supplies. We can change either one of these inputs, right? So you could either shift demand, like we said, oh, I don't want spaghetti anymore. Or we can shift supply and say, well, we'll just make more supply available or less supply available. And the same thing happens. Instead of equilibrium being here, we increase the supply. And so the price went lower because supply became bigger, right? Availability is this line here. This is less available. And on this end is more available. And then here is low price to high price. So what do we have here? Well, more available, demand here, that's the price. So we'll just keep that in mind for how it works. So let me give you a real life example. And this will hopefully make sense for supply and demand. We're in the middle of the COVID-19 scare, right? The coronavirus. And we know that hospitals are very concerned and people don't want to get this virus. So they want to have protection. So one of the things that people will do, in hospitals in particular, is they will wear safety equipment like a mask. And the masks right now that are sought after are the N95 mask. It's a mask that is really good at screening things out so that you don't accidentally breathe in the coronavirus and catch it. Okay, so we want these masks. Well, since the start of the coronavirus scare, did the supply of masks change? Did it go up or down? And this may sound tricky, but no, it really didn't. The same manufacturing for the most part was available. It may have gone down a little bit temporarily if we had some companies shut down, but for the most part, governments said, no. But what happened is, so the supply didn't go down. Did it go up? Well, no, it certainly didn't go up, right? So then did the demand for masks go down, right? With this scare, did fewer people want these masks? Absolutely not. In fact, quite the opposite. The demand for masks, it should say up on screen here. This is my mistake. So did the demand for masks go down? No. Did the demand here go up? Yes. So if the demand goes up, what does it look like? Well, we had the same supply, right? But in economics, we had supply side shift, right? Or we didn't have supply side shift. So we had a demand side shift. So the demand shifted from over here to we really want these masks. And look at the price. If somebody was going to price gouge, they could, because we used to have the price of masks here. We had about this much unavailable, and this is what the need was. But now we have this much demand, and the supply is actually much more restricted. So, I probably said this backwards. Less available on this end, super available on this side. So supply is a non-factor, demand is non-factor. But this, what we did was we shifted the curve. Okay, we moved demand this way, and the equilibrium moved up, and so price moved up. And that's ultimately the way the market always works. Okay, when people will say things like, well, the price went up higher or lower or this or that, what happened is one of two things. Either the supply changed or the demand changed. Okay, if you really want something, you'll pay more for it. If you really want N95 masks, you pay more. If you really want hand sanitizer, right? Some people bought up hand sanitizer at the dollar stores, and then they were trying to sell them for $17 a bottle, and people were willing to pay for it because there was not enough available. There was not enough supply, but the demand was really high, and so the demand curve shifted and the price changed. That's the nature of economics. Now, I'm not going to tell you whether it's good, bad, or otherwise morally for somebody to take and buy up all the hand sanitizer and then increase the price a whole bunch. If we were purely capitalists, we would say, hey, that's their right to do it. That's what the market will bear, and that's just good business. But then most of us will look at this and say, well, there's a certain amount where we're taking advantage of other people too. And so we want to temper what we do. But the reality is the market makes that, it fixes the problem, right? If you think about, if hand sanitizer was all of a sudden super valuable, then a bunch of people would start making hand sanitizer. And once they started making the sanitizer, then the price would come back down because the supply would increase. And the only thing that might keep that from happening would be, say, the government making regulations on who's allowed to make hand sanitizer. So if it regulates the hand sanitizer and you can't get more people to make it, then what did we do? Well, we just affected the supply, didn't we? We had supply side economics on one, and then we had demand side on the other. So there's your example. All right, gang. So the bonus question for today, I have to think of one off the top of my head right now. It's going to be for tomorrow, is how does supply and demand affect the price of the stock market? Okay, so we're going to figure out how does it affect the price of the stock market? And so here's the question. If a company buys back its own stock, is it, how it'll be more open-ended, but if a company buys back its own stock, how does that affect the price based on supply and demand? All right, so we'll cover that one tomorrow. Meanwhile, if you've got additional questions, like I said, keep them in the comments, and also please email to us at info@littlejohnfs, and we'll continue to try to work those in. But for now, our time is up for the day, so I will say thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you have enjoyed as always, and let me figure out back here. We're going to shut her down. Until next time, this has been David Littlejohn signing off.